and gentlemen, welcome back. Today I got a can control video for you guys that is going to be really easy to follow and teach you pretty much everything you need to know about can control. So hopping right into it, let's take a look at the difference between a high pressure and a low pressure can and what that difference looks like. Now this black can was kind of running on empty, so you'll see I'll go ahead and spray over a couple of areas a couple of times. In this example, you'll see me spray like a little black dot, and then I take a low pressure can and I spray a little red dot. You can immediately see the size difference between these two, with the high pressure outputting more paint. Because the can has a lot more pressure to it, it's going to push the paint out with more force, which this is going to make the can harder to control. But this is really good for things like flares, filling in, coverage. Now the low pressure can, on the other hand, is a lot more controlled, and as a result, you can typically get a little bit more details with it. You'll see low pressure cans used a lot more for production walls and things of that sort, things that require a little more nuance. Now we're going to talk about one of the things that I think is one of the more important topics when it comes to can control, and this is your grip on the actual can and the cap. This plays a massive role to how your line comes out, and it gives you tremendous amounts of control. This is when your finger strength kind of comes into play. So if you're so ladies and gentlemen, work out that stamina with that fingers, and don't take that out of context, you perverts, because your finger will get tired doing this. You see, we're gonna start off with our full finger pressed entirely on top of the cap, and we're gonna press with a pretty good amount of pressure, and you'll see we get a fat line. Now we're gonna do the same thing, but we're gonna apply less pressure onto the cap, and you'll notice our line comes out a little thinner. And now we're gonna apply even less pressure, and we get a much thinner line. Now we're switching from that full grip to the partial grip on the way back of the cap, and this is applying a good amount of pressure. And you'll see, despite applying a good amount of pressure to the back of the cap, we're getting just as thin of a line as we did when we applied a small amount of pressure to the entire cap. Now we'll change it up a little bit with the same exact grip with our finger on the way back of the cap, but we'll apply a tiny bit amount of pressure, and as a result we get a super thin line. Now that we talked about the actual can you're using, let's move over to the caps. Now these things come in a bunch of different varieties, and they all do pretty much different things. I won't be going into what caps work on what cans in this video, because it's more so about technique and can control. But caps come in three major different categories, where you have your fat caps, your skinny caps, and then your normal kind of stock caps. New York fat caps are pretty standard, and everybody's used them, so we're all pretty much familiar with that. So we'll use that as our middle ground. So you'll see the New York fat cap creates a 4-finger wide spray, just about that much, with a standard distance. Now our skinny cap, on the other hand, creates a much smaller spray, and you can see that by comparison. When we then look at our fat cap, it creates a much bolder, much more filled in, and larger spray than the other ones. Now when talking about can control, we have to talk about how close you are to the wall when you spray. That plays a massive role in how your line looks and comes out. The closer you are to the wall, the thinner your line's going to be, but the higher risk of dripping you're going to have, especially with a higher pressure can. Now if you move further away from the wall, you produce a line that's less likely to drip, but it may not be as opaque, and it's certainly going to be larger. But another massive factor to how your line comes out is how fast you swing that can across the wall. We'll touch on this a little bit later, but this is a good point to note that how you angle the can also matters a lot. If you have too much wrist action, you'll create a little bit of a dusty effect, and your spray will flare out, as you'll see here. However, if you go to nice paced speed, that's relatively fast, but parallel to the wall at all times, you won't get that dusty effect. The faster you swing a can across the wall, the thinner the line's going to be, but if you're not really used to it, the less control you may have. Now as you can see, we're going a lot slower, and as a result, we're getting a thicker, bolder line here. Moving on to the next topic, flares. I know a lot of you guys want to do them. Now the technique we're about to talk about is used for a lot more than just flares. It's used for getting clean lines, it's used for cutting back, it's used for getting blends in your pieces, and a lot more. But I'm gonna teach you guys how to flare, because I know that's what you want to know. Now the trick to flares is to let the paint catch onto the wall. You don't want to just swing your can everywhere hoping you get a flare. You want to spray, let it catch, and then drag it down. And there's really two kinds of different flares. You have the flare where your hand is parallel to the wall, and it stays that way, but you start off farther and then you get closer. Remember, this is an extension off the beginning of the video when I talked about the distance of the can. And that's what this looks like. You'll see this kind of flare has a ring at the fattest side. Keep in mind, different caps, different cans will give you different kinds of flares, so that always plays a role. A fatter cap with a high pressure can should give you some pretty satisfying flares. But now if we change it up and we bend our wrist just a little bit, you'll notice that the spray is now angled. And what's happening is the spray coming out the bottom of the cap is going to catch onto the wall first, and the spray coming out the top of the cap isn't going to catch on the wall as much or as soon. So what'll end up happening is the top of the flare will kind of dust out a lot more. Here's what it looks like. Now remember when I said that this technique is used for a lot of different things? This same flare technique is used in order to kind of cut lines, as well as used to fill in the edge of something. And I'll demonstrate that here. You'll see that I'm angling the can towards where I want the dusty side of the spray to go. What happens when you do this is the side closer to your hand is really fine and clean cut. This is why it's great to fill in the edges of your piece. And all of that dusted spray isn't gonna matter because you're gonna fill all of that in anyway. Another tremendous topic that's very important, especially for newer graffiti artists to kind of get the handle of, is not using your wrist for everything. You have to know how to move your whole body for can control. You see, there's different ways to make a line, and this even goes for just sketching in your books as well. You can use your wrist for slightly longer lines, you can use your elbow for even a little bit longer lines, your shoulder, and then your whole body. And you can see as I use different limbs, I'm getting shorter or longer lines. And you'll see if I need to make a really long line, I'll use my entire body. But when you're doing this, keep in mind what kind of line you want. Because once again, remember what we taught earlier. Even if you're using your whole body to go across the entire wall for a super long line, you might want to keep that can parallel to the wall so you get a nice crisp line like you saw here. If you let your wrist kind of flail out or your hand flail out towards the end, you'll get that dusted spray, which maybe you don't want. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's video. Hopefully this taught you a little something about can control. If you found it useful, be sure to let me know in the comments down below and drop a like. It helps a ton with the channel. And feel free to share it with your crew. Also, when you're down there in the comments, let me know. Do you want a part 2? I can go a lot more in depth with can control. In the next video, we can go over some more techniques, some application, as well as random can control tips, like how to get more paint out of older cans. Now, for anybody who's new here, my name is John Grimm. We do art-related content every single week, so feel free to subscribe, become part of the family. I'd love to have you. I'll see you guys next time, but until then, peace.